He didn't shake her hand. That was the first thing Vivian noticed when she walked into the boardroom that morning. Her husband of 11 years stood at the head of the table, surrounded by lawyers and junior executives in pressed suits, and when she entered, he didn't even look up. She had driven 40 minutes in the rain. She had left the hospital early. She had a bandage on her left arm, where they'd drawn blood just 2 hours before, and she hadn't eaten since the previous night because the nausea had gotten worse again, the kind that started behind her eyes and worked its way down until she couldn't think straight. But she was here. She had shown up the way she always showed up. His name was Sterling Albright. She had loved him for 15 years, married him for 11, and built a company with him for 8. Albright Voss Capital Management. Her name wasn't on the door. That had been his idea, and she had agreed because she trusted him, because she was 32 years old and in love, and thought that kind of thing didn't matter. She was 38 now. She knew better. "We can wait for you to sit," said the lawyer on his left. A man named Holt. She had never met him before. Sterling had a team of lawyers she knew by first name. Holt was not one of them. She sat across from her husband. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at him the way you look at someone when you are trying to decide if the person in front of you is the same one you fell in love with, or if that version of him is simply gone. He slid a folder across the table. He still hadn't looked at her. "We need you to sign these," he said. She opened the folder. The words "dissolution of marriage" sat at the top of the first page in 12-point Times New Roman, as if the end of her life could be formatted like a memo. She closed the folder. "Sterling, the terms are fair," he said. "You'll keep the house in Beacon Hill. The accounts we opened jointly before the company formed, and a settlement that should, Sterling." He looked up then. She had hoped that when he did, she would see something. Regret, maybe, or guilt, or even just the ordinary human decency of a man who knows he is about to hurt someone and wants to acknowledge it. There was nothing. His eyes were clear and dry and already somewhere else. "When did you decide this?" she asked. He glanced at Holt. "My client would prefer to keep this. I'm not talking to you," she said without turning her head. "I'm talking to my husband." A pause. Sterling straightened a pen on the table in front of him, parallel to the edge. She had watched him do that 10,000 times. It meant he was uncomfortable but wouldn't say so. "It's been coming for a while," he said. "You know that." She did not know that. Or maybe she had known something was wrong for months. The late nights, the way he stopped asking how she was feeling, the way he had gone from being a man who left notes on her coffee cup to a man who barely said good morning. But knowing something is wrong is different from knowing this. Knowing this specific clinical, folder across the table version of wrong. "I have a doctor's appointment at 2, she said. Her voice was steady. She didn't know how. The results from last week's scan. "Vivienne? I've been going alone." She said it simply, not as an accusation. "Every appointment since March. I just want you to know that." Something crossed his face. She couldn't name it. "I'll have someone drive you," he said. She almost laughed. She didn't sign the papers that day. She took the folder, stood up, nodded once to the lawyers, and walked out of the boardroom with the same measured steps she used when she left a negotiation that wasn't going her way. It was a skill she had learned from her mother, who had grown up in rural Georgia with nothing and built a small catering empire through sheer will and the ability to never let anyone see you break. Vivienne had been breaking for 6 months. She had just been doing it quietly, at home, alone, in the bathroom with the shower running so no one could hear. She got into her car. She sat in the parking garage for 12 minutes. Then she called her doctor. The scan results, as it turned out, were not what she had feared. The mass in her left kidney was benign, treatable. She was going to be fine. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and cried for the first time in 4 months. Her mother's name was Dorothea Voss. She had come to Boston in 1987 with 2 suitcases and a cousin's address written on a napkin, and had eventually built Voss Culinary Services into one of the most respected catering companies in New England. She was 71 years old, sharp as anyone Vivienne had ever met, and when Vivienne called her from the parking garage and told her what had happened, there was a long silence on the line. "Tell me exactly what the folder said," Dorothea said. Vivienne told her. Another silence. "Did you sign anything? No good." A pause. "Come to the house. Don't go home tonight." "Mama." Come to the house. She went to the house. Dorothea had made food. She always made food when something was wrong, as if a good meal could anchor a person back to themselves. And they sat at the kitchen table, with plates of baked chicken and sweet potatoes between them, and Dorothea listened to everything Vivienne said without interrupting once. Then she said, "That building on Meridian Street. Is it still in your name?" Vivienne looked up. "What?" "The commercial property on Meridian. The one your father bought in '94, before he passed. The one I put in your name when you turned 25, because I didn't want it mixed up in probate." She took a sip of her tea. "Is it still in your name?" Yes, I never transferred it. When we were setting up the company, and I said I'd look into it, and then I never did. He forgot about it." Dorothea nodded slowly. "And the 3 units on Copeland Avenue?" Vivienne set down her fork. The 3 units on Copeland Avenue had been a gift from her grandmother, her mother's mother, Alma Voss, who had bought them in the 1970s when the neighborhood was still cheap, and held on to them for 30 years until she died, and left them to Vivienne at 19. Vivienne had managed them quietly ever since. The income went into a separate account she'd kept long before Sterling, one she'd simply never mentioned because it had never come up. "Those are mine," she said. "Yes," Dorothea said. "They are." They looked at each other across the kitchen table. Outside, rain tapped against the window. The kitchen smelled like rosemary and cornbread. "How much is the Meridian building worth?" Vivienne asked. Her mother picked up her fork. "More than his offer." She didn't call a lawyer that night. She called one the next morning, a woman named Imani Beauchamp, who had been 2 years ahead of Vivienne at Spelman and was now one of the sharpest divorce attorneys in Boston. They had stayed in loose touch over the years, the kind of friendship maintained by occasional texts and liking each other's photos online. Vivienne had never expected to need her professionally. Imani listened to everything on the phone without saying much. Then she said, "Send me the folder. Don't sign a word. And tell me everything you own that he doesn't know about." Vivienne told her about Meridian Street, about Copeland Avenue, about the account in her name at a credit union in Quincy that she'd had since she was 22, where she put money every month the way her mother had taught her, quietly, consistently, without making a production of it. There was a pause on the line. "Vivienne," Imani said slowly, "do you know how much of your company's primary office space is currently leased?" "Most of it. We moved the main office 3 years ago to that building on." She stopped. "On Meridian Street," Imani said. The silence between them lasted 5 full seconds. Albright Voss Capital Management had its offices in the Meridian Street building. The building that Sterling had negotiated a lease for, at a rate he'd called extremely favorable with a landlord he had described as an old family contact of Vivienne's. He had signed the lease. He had written the checks. He had never asked whose name was on the deed. The deed that had Vivienne's name on it. "He's been paying rent to you for 3 years, Imani said, "and he doesn't know it." Vivienne put her hand over her mouth. "I need to get to my office," Imani said. "Do not talk to Sterling or his lawyers until you hear from me." She didn't go home. She stayed at her mother's house for 3 days, sleeping in her old room under a quilt Dorothea had made by hand in 1999. She went to her regular doctor's appointment. She ate her mother's cooking. She sat on the back porch in the evenings and watched the sky go from gold to gray and tried to remember who she had been before she became Mrs. Albright. She had been good at things. That was the honest truth of it, stripped of false modesty. She had graduated top of her class. She had worked in finance before Sterling, had her own clients, her own reputation. When they built Albright Voss together, she had been the one who managed the due diligence process, the one who built the investor relationships, the one who stayed until 9 and came back at 7. Sterling was the front of house. He was charming and photogenic and good in a room. She had been fine with that. She had been too fine with too many things. On the 3rd day, her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. She answered it anyway. "This is Courtney," said the voice on the other end. It was a woman's voice, younger than Vivienne, and nervous. "Courtney Aldane? I've been working with Sterling for about 2 years, in a capacity that I need to tell you about." Vivienne sat down on the edge of her old bed. "How did you get this number?" she asked, his assistant. She said you should know." She should have hung up. She almost did. Instead she said, Go ahead. Courtney Aldane was 29. She was a junior analyst at the firm. She had been involved with Sterling for 18 months. She was not calling to apologize. She said that first, clearly, which Vivian respected. But she had recently found out that Sterling had told her Vivian was aware of the arrangement, that it was a mutual agreement, that the marriage was already over in all but paperwork. He lied to me, Courtney said. I don't know if that matters to you, but I thought you should know it wasn't. I didn't think I was hurting someone who didn't know. Vivienne looked at the quilt on the bed. Her mother had made it from squares of old fabric. A dress from when Vivienne was 7, a shirt of her father's, curtains from the living room they'd had before the move to the bigger house. It was the kind of thing you made when you wanted to hold on to things. It matters, Vivienne said. Thank you for calling. She hung up and sat very still for a long moment. Then she texted Imani. He told the other woman the marriage was already over. She believed him. She called me. Imani responded in under a minute. This is actually helpful. Don't respond to Sterling yet. Let him wonder. Sterling called on the 4th day. She let it go to voicemail. He called again on the 5th. She listened to the message this time. His voice was different than it had been in the boardroom, less certain. There was something around the edges of it that she recognized. The particular register he used when he realized a deal wasn't going the way he'd planned, and he needed to recalibrate. Vivienne, I think we should talk before this goes further. Holt has been reviewing some things, and there are some details about the lease arrangements that came up, and I think we should talk. Call me back. She forwarded the voicemail to Imani. Imani's response, he figured it out. Good. Meet me tomorrow. 9 a.m. The meeting was at Imani's office on Commonwealth Avenue, a clean room with good light and 2 chairs that faced each other across a low table. Imani Beauchamp had the kind of stillness that some people mistake for coldness. She didn't waste movement, didn't perform warmth she didn't feel, and when she laid documents on the table, she did it with the precision of someone who had prepared for exactly this conversation. Here's where we are, Imani said. The Meridian Street building is solely in your name. It has been since 2001. The lease your husband signed 3 years ago is a valid commercial lease with you as the lessor. He has been paying roughly $14,000 a month to an LLC that traces back to you, which means he has, technically, been funding your legal costs for this divorce for the past 36 months. Vivienne looked at the documents. He never did a title search. He didn't think he needed to. He said it was a family contact. He trusted that. He trusted me, Vivienne said quietly. Imani looked at her steadily. And you didn't breach that trust. You never hid this from him. You answered honestly when he asked, said you'd look into it, and then it fell off the radar. He didn't. His lawyers will argue I concealed it. They can argue that. They won't win it. There's no concealment if no one asked. And his original dissolution offer was based on an asset inventory that his team prepared, and an inventory that doesn't list the Meridian property or the Copeland Avenue units, which means he was either uninformed or strategically excluded them. Either way, that offer is void. Vivienne exhaled. What does he actually have? Imani turned a page. His personal accounts, his stake in the company, which is now complicated since the company's primary address is your property and there's a question of whether the lease terms affect his equity claims, his car, his investment portfolio. She paused. A lot less than he thought he was walking away with. And what do I have? The buildings, the Copeland units, your personal accounts, your share of the company, which is currently being recalculated by a forensic accountant I brought in last week, and leverage. Imani folded her hands. Significant leverage. She went home that afternoon, to the house in Beacon Hill that Sterling had said she could keep, as if it were a gift, as if he were being generous. She walked through the room slowly, running her hand along the back of the sofa, stopping in the kitchen where they had cooked dinner together for years, where they had sat on Saturday mornings with the newspaper and not spoken much because they hadn't needed to. She was not sentimental about objects, but she was honest with herself about what she had lost, and standing in that kitchen, she let herself feel it without performing stoicism. She had loved him. That was real. She had worked beside him and built something with him and believed in the version of themselves they were building toward, and that version was gone now, and grief didn't need to be complicated to be true. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the garden, her garden, technically, because she was the one who had planted it, and thought about what she wanted. Not what she was owed, not what she could win, what she actually wanted. She wanted to not feel small again. She wanted to walk into a room and not wonder if the person she trusted most was about to slide a folder across the table. She wanted to know the way her mother had taught her to know that the ground she stood on was her own. She picked up her phone and called Imani. "Tell Sterling's lawyers I'm ready to negotiate." The negotiation lasted 3 weeks. Sterling's new lawyers, Holt had been quietly replaced, came in with a revised offer, a better one. They were no longer certain of the ground they were standing on, and it showed in every document they submitted, in every counter-proposal that walked back something they'd confidently asserted a week before. Sterling himself appeared in person only once, at Imani's insistence, for a formal session that lasted 2 hours. He sat across the table from Vivienne, and for the first time since the boardroom, she saw him look genuinely uncertain. Not remorseful. She didn't think Sterling Albright was built for remorse the way other people were, but uncertain, which in some ways was more honest. "You could have just told me about the building," he said at one point, when the lawyers had stepped out. She looked at him. "You could have asked." He didn't have an answer for that. "You built this with me," she said. "I don't want to burn it down. I want what's mine, and I want to walk away cleanly, and I want you to stop pretending that you're doing me any favors." He was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, Commonwealth Avenue ran busy and gray beneath a November sky. "Okay," he said finally. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a concession. It was just the word okay, said by a man who had run out of a particular kind of momentum. It was enough. The final settlement gave Vivienne her share of the company's equity, valued fairly by a court-appointed accountant. It gave her the Meridian building outright, the Copeland units outright, and the house in Beacon Hill, which she had already decided to sell. She didn't need it. It was full of the particular silence that accumulates in rooms where something ended. She bought a condo near her mother's house instead. Smaller. Full of light. She planted herbs on the kitchen windowsill and subscribed to a Saturday morning yoga class, and for the first time in years, sat through a Sunday without anything she was supposed to be doing. Imani filed the final paperwork on a Tuesday in December. It was done. Her mother called that evening. "How do you feel?" Dorothea asked. Vivienne stood at her kitchen window with a cup of tea, watching the last light go out of the sky. Her arm was healed where they'd drawn blood. Her scan results were still clean. She had a meeting on Thursday with a venture capital group who had reached out to her personally about an advisory role. They had said they'd heard good things about her work, specifically her work, not the company's work. "Like the ground is mine," she said. Dorothea was quiet for a moment. Then, "Good. That's how it's supposed to feel." Outside, the streetlights came on one by one down the block, each one catching a moment of the wet pavement and turning it briefly bright. Vivienne watched them and thought about her grandmother, who had bought 3 small units in a struggling neighborhood 50 years ago because she had believed the ground would hold. And it had. It had held, and it had been passed to Dorothea, and Dorothea had passed it to Vivienne, and Vivienne had stood on it without even knowing she was standing on something solid, until the moment someone tried to take everything else away. The tea was warm in her hands. The city moved outside. She stayed at the window a little longer, not because she was waiting for anything, but because she had finally stopped running the clock on someone else's schedule, and the stillness felt like something she had earned.